As if Appalachia didn't already have a reputation for being mysterious in its very nature, there have been plenty of unsolved cases to back up that prevailing ethos. One of the most mysterious of the unsolved cases is the Sodder children's disappearance in Fayetteville, West Virginia in 1945. On Christmas Eve, 1945, a fire burned down the Sodder family house in Fayetteville, West Virginia. 5 of the Sodder children were never seen again. While the official story says they died in the fire that night, a wave of strange circumstances and conflicting evidence would say otherwise. George Sodder and his wife Jenny were both immigrants from Italy. George never spoke about why he left Italy for the U.S., but it was clear he did not like Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. George bothered a lot of people in the town of Fayetteville with his anti-Mussolini rhetoric, as Fayetteville, West Virginia, where he and his family lived, was known for its massive population of Italian immigrants. He got under their skin so much so that an insurance salesman told George that his house would, quote, go up in smoke, and that his children would, quote, be destroyed. This happened only a couple of months before the Sodder children's disappearance. Oddly, this wasn't the only seemingly random threat that George Sodder received. Close in time to the disappearance of the Sodder children, a man looking for work allegedly told George Sodder that the fuse boxes at his house would, quote, cause a fire one day. This was particularly strange because George had just rewired the house and had it inspected by the local electric company. Finally, in the weeks of December leading up to the disappearance of the Sodder children noticed that a strange car was watching them as they came home from school. Who was watching the children, and why? Christmas Eve, 1945, began like any other, as the family had opened a few early gifts and started their nightly bed routine for most of the children. Jenny Sodder allowed some of the older children to stay up past 10 to finish chores, while Jenny and the youngest daughter went to bed. At 12:30 a.m., the telephone rang, waking Jenny, who then went downstairs to answer the phone. When she picked up the phone, she heard the voice of a woman who she did not know. The woman in question asked Jenny about a person who she had never heard of, while laughing and the toasting of glasses could be heard in the background. Jenny told the caller she had the wrong number, hung up, and went back to bed, but later said the woman's unusual laugh haunted her for months. On her way back to bed, Jenny noticed the lights were still on, and the curtains were not drawn, which should have been taken care of by the children before bed. At approximately 1 a.m., Jenny heard a loud smash from something hitting the roof of the house, which quickly turned into a rolling noise. Thinking nothing of it, she fell asleep again. A short time later, Jenny woke back up and smelled smoke. Searching for the epicenter of the smoke, she found her husband George's office in flames, specifically around the telephone line and the fuse box. Jenny immediately woke George, and they both gathered as many children as they could. Unfortunately, only 4 of the 9 children at the house that night escaped, as the rest of the children were sleeping in the attic, which had already been blocked by vicious flames on the stairwell. One of the now safe Sodder children, Marion, rushed to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. The operator nor the fire department could be reached. Instantaneously, a passerby in a car also tried to call the fire department from the phone of a tavern, but was also unsuccessful. It wasn't until someone reached a phone in the center of town that the fire department was alerted. George Sodder, unable to find his missing children in the blaze, tried to rescue them himself. First, he searched for the family ladder, but was unable to find it as it was not in its usual place. It would later be found in a very strange place. So he climbed on the outside of the house, up to a window, and tried to smash it to get it to the attic to help the children. Unsuccessful in his attempt to gain access to the attic, he tried bringing his 2 business trucks up to the house to help him climb into the attic. But oddly, they wouldn't start, even though they had worked perfectly up until that night. With no more options and the fire department nowhere to be seen, the Sodder family watched as their house burned all the way to the ground over the next 45 minutes. The fire department didn't reach the Sodder residence until the next morning, which by that time had become a smoldering pile of disaster. Supposedly, the fire department was already low on manpower due to the war and the fact that each individual firefighter had to be called to the fire separately. According to the fire chief, F.J. Morris, the reason they couldn't reach the Sodder house that night was because they didn't have anyone qualified to drive the truck. They had to wait until that firefighter reached the station to drive the truck to the house. Why in the world would the fire chief himself not have the ability to drive the fire truck? It just makes no sense. As the fire had burned itself out by early morning on Christmas Day, all that was left were the ashes in the basement of the house. Next came the investigations. What would follow would be a torrent of conflicting reports, misinformation, and laziness by investigators and media alike. This would solidify that the official story of the circumstances surrounding the fire could never be fully trusted as the truth. At 10 a.m., the first investigation had been completed by the fire chief, who said that they found no bones in what was left of the house. A conflicting report claims that they actually found both bone fragments and organs, but refused to tell the family. Either way, it's important to note that modern fire investigators determined that the investigation was lazy at best, and in no way could have satisfied any forthcoming conclusions. Regardless, Chief Morris believed that the 5 Sodder children who were unaccounted for had died in the flames, but there was no official proof. No bodies were ever recovered. Since it was Christmas Day, further investigations beyond the preliminary one would be postponed and deferred to the state fire marshal's office. The Sodder family was told not to disturb the scene so they could come back at a later date. Well, the Sodder family, too grief-stricken to think clearly, covered the scene with dirt as they wanted to turn the area into a memorial garden for their children. The next day, the coroner convened an inquest to determine the cause of the fire and subsequent cause of death of the 5 Sodder children. It was determined by a jury that the fire was caused by faulty wiring, and the 5 Sodder children, Maurice, age 14, Martha Lee, age 12, Louis, age 10, Jenny Irene, age 8, and Betty, age 6, died in the fire despite no bodies being found. As death certificates were completed for the children, the media pounced on the story. One media outlet claimed all the children's bodies had been found, and also that only one part of one of the bodies had been found. This contradiction was done in the same article. Needless to say, the media in no way was going to help this case. This lazy reporting done by the media was the best example of the whole investigation into the Sodder children's disappearance. No one seemed to have a clue what the truth was, but they still tried to guess what happened based on nothing more than stupidity. In reality, no one knew what had happened to the Sodder children. Instead, they all simply landed on assumptions and speculation. The official story of what happened to the Sodder children on that fateful night created more questions than it answered. The family was the first to notice these inconsistencies. The first strange occurrence was the mystery of the missing ladder. George Sodder had tried to use it the night of the fire to save his children, but couldn't find it in its usual place. As it turns out, the ladder was later located at the bottom of a ditch almost 100 feet away from the side of the house where it usually would have been. How did the ladder get so far away from the house that night? Then, there was the official story of the cause of the fire. Officials claimed it was faulty wiring, which should have resulted in the power to the house going out. But instead, the family remembers their Christmas lights staying on well into the blaze that night. The first massive piece of evidence that showed something bigger was going on came from a visit from a telephone repairman that revealed the Sodders' house phone had been cut in the fire, not burned, as the official report states. In order to cut the phone line, someone would have had to climb 14 feet up a pole and reach outwards several feet to cut it. Someone purposefully cut their phone line that night. Luckily, a neighbor happened to remember that they saw someone stealing a block and tackle from the Sodder property on the night of the fire. This was corroborating evidence that perhaps someone had been tampering with the Sodder home that night. Eventually, a man was identified and arrested for the theft of the Sodder family's property. The man admitted to cutting the phone line, but said he thought he was cutting a power line. There's no official report identifying this guy or explaining why he would be trying to cut the Sodders' power line if he was simply trying to steal something from them. It makes absolutely no sense. The guy simply vanishes from the record after his interview. According to Jenny Sodder, she said that if the man had indeed succeeded in splitting the power line, then none of the family would have survived the fire. Also, there was the coincidence of the Sodders' business trucks failing to start that night. George Sodder always believed that someone had tampered with their trucks that night, and it easily could have been the man who tried to cut the power line and stole the block and tackle from their house. The last bit of mystery from the official story of the fire was the explanation of no bodies or bones being found in the ashes of the fire. The family could never understand how no remains were left over, and honestly, neither could anyone else. In fact, no one but the family ever tried to figure it out. Jenny Sodder began her own investigation into what happens to bodies when they're inside a fire. She was bothered by the fact that most of the family's appliances were still recognizable after the fire, so she took it upon herself to find answers. She looked to a similar fire that had been recounted by local media in which a family of 7 had died. In this particular house fire, the remains of all the victims were said to have been found. As we know, you can't always trust the media, but the evidence against the official report was adding up. Unsatisfied, Jenny moved on to conducting an experiment of her own in which she burned animal bones. After the fire, all the bones remained intact. Finally, Jenny questioned an employee of a local crematorium and asked if human bones would be consumed in a fire. The employee said that human bones are known to withstand fires of over 2,000 degrees for multiple hours, which would have been hotter and longer than the Sodder fire itself. As the Sodder family searched for answers, they could only find one answer that seemed satisfactory and congruent with the truth. This was the strange call in the middle of the night prior to the fire. Investigations eventually led to a woman admitting she was on the other end of that strange call that night, and police confirmed she had dialed the wrong number. So, George Sodder received multiple threats on his family's life that included mentioning fire and fuse boxes. We know that a man cut their phone line, but tried to cut their power line. This man was seen by a witness on the night of the fire on the Sodder property stealing equipment. After the man supposedly admitted to being on the property and cutting their phone line, he vanished from the record. Was it a coincidence that the Sodder family ladder had been thrown hundreds of feet away from its usual spot beside the house? Or that the family truck suddenly wouldn't start? While these were important questions, the biggest question was if the children died in the fire, where are the remains? Jenny Sodder has good evidence from an expert that they would have found bones left over after the fire. With the official story claiming that the 5 Sodder children died in the fire on Christmas Eve, the case failed to go any further, despite the obvious questions the family still had about that night. That is, until early 1946, when certain witnesses and evidence came to light. The first witness to speak up was a bus driver, who had been passing through Fayetteville on Christmas Eve. He claimed to have seen multiple people throwing, quote, balls of fire at the Sodder house. Months after this witness came forward, the Sodder family found an object on their property that, according to George Sodder, looked like a hand grenade. George immediately thought back to Jenny saying she heard a thud on the roof, accompanied by a roll right before the fire. Could it have been a grenade that Jenny heard that night? These two pieces of evidence led to the Sodder family, for the first time publicly, claiming the fire marshal's report was incorrect and that their house fire had been caused by a deliberate act, not faulty wiring. Next, witnesses began popping up around the area claiming they had seen the missing Sodder children. One witness claimed to have seen the kids in a car leaving the Sodder residence while the fire was burning. Another witness believed she served the kids breakfast the next morning at a rest stop headed to Charleston, West Virginia. Who knows if these witnesses truly saw the Sodder children, but the evidence for foul play was mounting. To try and get a fresh pair of eyes on the case, the family hired C.C. Tinsley, a private investigator. Tinsley immediately began connecting pieces of information related to previous threats on the life of George Sodder and his family. George Sodder had been threatened before the fire by a local insurance salesman due to George's outspoken views against Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. The same man was a juror in the coroner's inquest that determined the cause of the Sodder children's death. On its own, this coincidence could mean nothing, but there were too many coincidences at this point not to at least look into a larger conspiracy in place. Eventually, Tinsley uncovered rumors that Fire Chief Morris had lied to the Sodder family about finding no bodies. The rumor claimed Morris had found a heart in the ashes of the fire, but instead of telling the family, he put it into a box and buried it without anyone knowing. When Tinsley approached Morris about the rumor, he confirmed the rumor and then took Tinsley and George Sodder to the location where he buried the heart. Upon examination of the heart by a funeral director, it turned out that what Morris said was a human heart was indeed a beef liver, with no evidence of being near a fire. So Tinsley went back to Morris and confronted him. Morris admitted that he himself had put the liver in the box and buried it, knowing it had nothing to do with the fire. He also said he did this so the family would later find the box and think their missing children had died in the fire. Clearly something bigger was at play. Why would Chief Morris get involved to this degree? If there was ever a case that didn't make sense, it was the Sodder children's disappearance. The simple lack of evidence that the children died in the fire, along with compelling evidence that the fire was intentional, necessitated a serious look at this as a deliberate crime and kidnapping. After George Sodder spent years following leads that never panned out, he asked for the FBI's help, but was declined by J. Edgar Hoover himself. With no other options on the table, George Sodder decided to re-examine the remains of the house fire in hopes of finding something he previously missed. To everyone's surprise, the search turned up bone fragments, and they were indeed human. They were proven to be human vertebrae, all from the same person. But the problem was that the estimated age of the person with these vertebrae did not line up with any of the Sodder children. Also, the bones had not shown any indication that they had been touched by flames. So the family was back where they were before the search. According to the examiner of these bones, he confirmed that the Sodder house fire had not burned hot enough or long enough for no remains to be found on the scene. Despite being a national news story, the case of the Sodder children's disappearance would be closed by the state in 1950. The FBI then took the case over as a potential kidnapping, but closed it after only 2 years of investigating. Over the years, the Sodder family did everything they could to find some sort of thread that would lead them to the truth. They offered rewards, but nothing materialized. From time to time, stories would come through from random places claiming they had seen the children with men of Italian descent, but every lead ended up being a dead one. There were only 2 instances that the Sodder family believed could have actually led them closer to the truth. The first was a tip from a woman in Texas in 1967, who claimed that one of the Sodder children, Louis, told her he was really a Sodder child. George Sodder went down to investigate. He could never find the woman who gave him the tip, but was able to find the man she referenced as a Sodder child. The man claimed he was not the son of George and Jenny Sodder. but George had a strange feeling that he actually might have been. The other lead came from a random letter that had been addressed to Jenny Sodder from Central City, Kentucky, with no return address. Inside the letter was a picture of a man in his 30s, which closely resembled Louis Sodder. On the back of the letter was written, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie." The Sodder family believed this to be the single most credible piece of information that their children were still alive somewhere. The letter would lead nowhere, however, as they could never find out who sent it. George Sodder died in 1969. Jenny Sodder died 20 years later in 1989. They never found out what really happened that Christmas Eve. But the Sodder family never gave up and never will, as their descendants still search for answers to this day. So what really happened to the Sodder children that night? Well, the official story of the Sodder family house fire and subsequent investigation is that the 5 children who did not escape died in the fire that night. There's no evidence to prove this is actually what happened, only circumstantial speculation and logic. Logic would infer that the children indeed died in the fire that night, but logic alone isn't enough to prove anything, especially the official story. The official stance of the family has been, and still is, that the children were somehow kidnapped before they were burnt by the fire. While George and Jenny never directly explained why someone would want to kidnap the children, their descendants believe it may have involved the Italian Mafia and George Sodder's comments surrounding Mussolini all those years ago. The truth of the matter is that we don't have any proof one way or the other about what happened to the Sodder children. That being said, there are conclusions that can be made about what most likely happened to them. As for the cause of the house fire, there are too many coincidences and conflicting witness statements for the fire to have been started by faulty wiring. The most likely cause of the fire is arson. The reason for this is not simply the fact that Jenny Sodder heard something hit the roof that night, roll, and then explode, but also the strange missing ladder, the dead trucks, the cut phone line, the strange man seen in their yard, and the threats made to the Sodder family. As for the disappearance of the Sodder children, part of me would like to think that they died in the fire that night because that would, at first glance, seem to be the most likely answer. But when you consider that no bones were found, after 2 investigations, combined with all these strange coincidences, another part of me thinks they were kidnapped somehow. Did the Italian Mafia have anything to do with the Sodder children's disappearance? I fully believe that either part of the Italian Mafia or people who were acting on the orders of someone with ties to the Mafia burned the Sodder family house down that night. Now, did the Italian Mafia kidnap the Sodder children? I don't know for sure, but I can say that there's one person in this story that makes me think they did. Fire Chief Morris. From the beginning of the investigations, he was making excuses and was proven to both lie to the family and intentionally try to make them believe false evidence. Why would he do this unless there was someone pulling his strings?